Well, good afternoon and welcome back to the ongoing Thursday, September 21st, 2021 Lane County Board of Commissioners meeting. We are on item 15A. Before I begin that item, I just want commissioners to know that I've been approached by more than one commissioner over the lunch break about obligations after this, so we will do our level best to attempt to end this meeting by 5 p.m. Having said that, item 15A is ordinance number 2107 in the matter of amending Lane Code 16.244 floodplain combining zone, FP, RCP, and Lane County 10.271 floodplain combining zone, and adopting a savings and severability clause. This is a public hearing. The date today is September 21, 2021. The proposed Lane Code amendments are subject to the applicable criteria identified in Lane Code 16.252(2) and applicable statewide planning goals. The order of proceedings for this hearing will be first the report by staff, followed by public testimony, and then additional comments by staff. The board's decision may be appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals in accordance with ORS Chapter 197. Is there any commissioner would like to disclose any abstentions due to conflict of interest or biases at this time? Okay, none, duly noted. Are there any challenges to the board's qualification to hear the matter? See none and certainly hear none. In that case, I now would request that Jill Surslav, Senior Planner, provide us with a report.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. And good afternoon, Commissioners. This is Rachel Surslav, Staff Planner for this project. And I do have a presentation to share for you. And so just give me one moment to share my screen here. All right, are you all seeing a presentation of floodplain code amendments?
Not yet. We see your screen.
Oh. Maybe I have it on the wrong one. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So again, this is Rachel Surslav, Staff Planner, and I'm here before you this afternoon to discuss some floodplain code amendments. And staff was last before you for a first reading on August 31st, and we're back before you today for a second reading and public hearing. And before I get started, I'll provide you with a little bit of project background. As you know, Lane Code floodplain regulations were recently amended with Ordinance 2008. And this project was an overhaul of the floodplain code that aimed to make Lane County's code more compliant with the National Flood Insurance Program and adopt higher regulatory standards at the direction of the board. And this new code was adopted and became effective earlier this year. The code amendment project before you today was initiated by the Land Management Division, and it aims to refine specific sections of the code, where upon implementation of this code, staff found revisions were necessary to carry out the intent of the regulations and the passing of Ordinance 2008. And specifically, the parts of the code identified as needing amendments are the higher ground provision, the compensatory storage.
I'm sorry, Ms. Surslav. Someone has a mic on and we're hearing clanging in the background. If they could turn that off. I apologize. Please continue.
That's no problem. Thank you. I was saying the parts of the code that we're looking to revise with this project are the higher ground provision, the compensatory storage for fill section, and some specific provisions within the floodway section. And this project was brought before the Lane County Planning Commission for a public hearing on June 1st of this year. After considering amendments and public comment, the commission deliberated on this project on July 6, 2021, and motioned to forward a recommendation to the board to adopt the proposed language with some minor revisions. And I will generally cover the existing code and the proposed changes in the following slides. The first item proposed for revision is the higher ground provision. And this is a provision that requires new construction of a dwelling, accessory structure, or farm use structure to be located outside of the floodplain, unless it can be demonstrated that no alternative building site exists on the property outside of the floodplain. The higher ground provision was added to the code at the board's direction during the previous code amendment process. And with implementation of this provision, it became clear that that replacement dwellings specifically would be subject to this standard, provided some definitions that are dictated by the National Flood Insurance Program, specifically the definition of new construction. And with the adoption of this provision, it was staff's understanding that the board did not intend for this provision to apply to replacement dwellings. So with this, these amendments that are before you, we aim to clarify that. And with this revision, staff also identified additional standards that could clarify implementation of the higher ground provision. So therefore, staff is proposing amendments to the provision to identify what structures the provision should apply to and to adopt necessary exceptions to the standard for when there is no alternative location outside of the floodplain that a development can be placed. The proposed language dictates that the standard only applies to new dwellings and not replacement dwellings, as opposed to the new construction, accessory structures, and farm use structures that was included in the old language. And the proposed code also includes several standards for when an exception can be made to the higher ground standard due to other aspects of the property that make it infeasible or impossible to locate development outside of the floodplain. For instance, development can't be required to be located outside of the floodplain when it would be impossible for that structure to meet property line setbacks in the area outside of the floodplain. Other exceptions that we identified were protected Class 1 streams or wetland areas that prevent the dwelling from being located outside of the floodplain, or when farm or forest resource zone siting criteria apply, easements that restrict development, and situations where the dwelling location has already been permitted either through approval of a land use permit that has identified the location of the dwelling. So moving into the floodway allowances, which is the other section of the code that we looked at revising. The currently adopted code and floodway provisions prohibit all development from the floodway with a few exceptions. These exceptions include replacement of structures that are lawfully existing in the floodway, if there's no higher ground that they can be relocated to. Utility facilities, public roads, and quarry and mining activities. And then also allowed in the floodway is a habitat restoration projects. And this exception is specific for projects that may increase base flood elevation in the floodway. And moving on to the proposed language, we're proposing to add an explicit allowance for habitat restoration and enhancement projects that do not create a rise. With the current language, it could be inferred that because a project is allowed that creates a rise, that the same project would be allowed when it doesn't create a rise, but that's not explicit in the language. So we aim to make that very clear in this revision. And the second change that we are proposing to the floodway allowances is for a minimal development allowance. Since mostly all development is prohibited from the floodway under the current code, staff have found that it's unnecessarily prohibitive for low impact and low value development in the floodway. And this revision aims to allow slightly more flexibility for properties that are already developed in the floodway. And it should be noted that even minimal development in the floodway would require a no-rise analysis to be completed so that we can determine that there would not be any impact on flood levels resulting from that development. And one last note on this is that during the Planning Commission review, a recommendation was made to clarify that minimal development could not be habitable structures, and staff has incorporated that recommendation into the draft code. And then the third section that we're proposing to revise is the compensatory storage for fill section. And staff is proposing to remove this section entirely. And upon implementation of this provision, staff have observed that the provision is acting more of a deterrent to development involving fill than actually mitigating the fill. The concept seems like a logical way to offset the effects of fill, but the actual effects of these standards are still generally unknown, and so we are proposing removal of that provision at this time. And I just wanted to talk a bit about the past action at the Planning Commission. With the passing of a recommendation for the board to adopt the proposed language, the Planning Commission also made revisions to the higher ground provisions. One policy question that was flagged for the Planning Commission was the citing of development considering steep slopes and floodplain, and should higher ground provisions consider slopes that are steep or potentially hazardous due to landslides. And in response to this, staff drafted language based on other land use standards regarding slopes and based on building department policy for building on or near slopes. And this exception allows new construction under the higher ground provision to be built in the floodplain if areas outside of the floodplain are composed of slopes greater than 20%, and the development cannot be set back a certain distance from those slopes. And then secondly, a need was identified to apply the higher ground exceptions that I discussed earlier to the floodway as well as the floodplain. The floodway language allows replacement of a structure in the floodway unless there's an alternative location outside of the floodway. This is the same issue that exists with the higher ground language that I discussed a little bit ago. And staff is proposing that this reference, or proposing a reference to those other exceptions to also apply to the floodway to provide more clarity and implementation of that standard. And these two changes have been incorporated into the draft code before you today. And then the last bit of code that I want to discuss is at the first reading of this ordinance, the board expressed some interest in altering the floodway language that requires replacement structures be replaced within the same footprint. And provided this language, staff has understood that replacement within the same footprint means that the structure would not be allowed to expand at all when it was replaced. And I have provided a supplemental memo to you all on this issue and provided a revised code language that allows a footprint increase of up to 20% and allows for the structure to be shifted on that footprint or to a higher grade in the floodway when a property is entirely within the floodway. And these changes, because they were discussed at the first reading of this ordinance, they have not been included into the draft ordinance at this point, but to adopt them, they would have to be referenced in the motion today, and a third reading of the ordinance would be necessary if the board wanted to incorporate these changes. And then I will briefly discuss some of the public comment that I received and has been entered into the record since the publishing of the staff report. And that comment was forwarded to you earlier today for your future review. And generally these comments request an emergency clause be enacted for this ordinance. A comment expressed support for excluding farm use structures from the higher ground provision. They raise issues with the reference to hazardous materials in the critical facilities definition, which was a topic that was discussed under the last during the last ordinance adoption process. And lastly, some comments express opposition to the minimal development allowance and the increase in the footprint for replacement structures in the floodway. And staff can respond to these comments in more detail after the verbal testimony has been provided today. And lastly, the board has several options today on this item. The public hearing and record could be closed or continued today. The ordinance could be adopted as is, or as I mentioned earlier, the board could read in the requested amendments to the floodway language, and staff could schedule a third reading to incorporate those amendments. Or lastly, the board could direct staff to make other changes to the ordinance, in which case it's likely there could be multiple readings needed if new language was drafted after today. And that concludes my staff report. Thank you, Chair Burney.
Thank you, Rachel Surslov. At this time, we are going to provide the opportunity for public testimony regarding the Lane Code floodplain combining zone amendments. After that, there may be additional comments from staff. Ms. Jones, before we begin, could you possibly ask for a show of hands so we have an idea of the number of people who will be providing public testimony?
Yes, at this time, if you have signed up for public testimony for this item, Ordinance 2107, please raise your virtual hand so I can get a head count on how many people we have wanting to speak. At this time, Chair Burney, I only see 2 hands raised.
Well, thank you very much. And in that case, there's no reason we need to limit people beyond 5 minutes for providing testimony. Ms. Jones, if you could call on people to provide public testimony, this would be the time.
Okay, and for clarification, we are going with 5 minutes, is that correct?
Up to 5 minutes, correct.
Okay, I need to change my timer. 1 moment.
I apologize, but if we only have 2 people.
Yeah, I will reset it as soon as we start. Just 1 second. At this time, I will call upon Michael Gallardi, followed by Johnny Mogstad. Michael, I will unmute your microphone and I will begin the timer, and you may begin your public comment. There you go.
Good afternoon, commissioners. As you heard, I'm Mike Gilardi. I'm a natural resources lawyer. And for the record, my address is P.O. Box 8529 in Coburg, 97408. I'm here today to discuss the critical facilities provisions of the floodplain rules. And there is a mistake in the critical facilities rules that's similar to the other mistakes that you're trying to fix with this new round of rulemaking. You may recall that we discussed the critical facilities provisions several times during the rulemaking last year. As a reminder, what the rules say is that if you qualify as a critical facility, then you have to go through a land use process to prove that there's no alternative to putting your facility in the floodplain, which is a very difficult standard. Now, critical facilities are defined as, what you would expect: fire, police, schools, but it also includes this catch-all provision of any facility that stores or uses hazardous materials. And hazardous materials are defined very broadly in accordance with federal and state environmental laws. There's a huge range of materials that are captured there. And so the board wrestled with, how do you prevent that definition from being overly broad? And at the very end of the proceedings last year, about a week before Christmas, I think it was, in the final reading, the staff came up with this idea to tie the hazardous materials definition to the way that hazardous materials are treated in the building code. Now, the problem is that there is no simple list of hazardous materials in the building codes and what the thresholds are for different materials. Once the rules were enacted, I went to the staff and tried to get some clarity for how these rules would actually operate in practical scenarios, such as when a farmer was going to build an agricultural building on their farm or a fuel storage tank. And staff wasn't able to answer that. I went to environmental engineers and asked them. Nobody really understands how these rules would work in practice. And so out of that void comes Thousand Friends of Oregon, who tells the Planning Commission this summer that the critical facilities rules and the other rules that you're trying to fix should be used to prevent farmers from building agricultural buildings on their farms in the floodplain, which makes no sense as a policy matter, is inconsistent with state law that protects farm uses and structures associated with farm uses from local land use regulation. And it's important to know that we're talking about the entire floodplain here. There's a lot of the farmland in Lane County is in the floodplain, large areas around Junction City and the Mohawk and the McKenzie Valley. So we're not talking about putting buildings on the edge of a river. We're talking about a large area of working farmland. So I implore the board to fix this. What I proposed last year and what I reiterate now is to just strike the reference to hazardous materials from that critical facilities definition. There's no reason to have that, because these materials are already regulated by a few different environmental laws. I provided some summary materials about that to you yesterday. And the flood rules themselves have practical engineering solutions to this. For example, if you have a fuel storage tank, you have to elevate it 2 feet above the base flood elevation. So there are practical ways to ensure that these materials stay out of floodwaters. There's no need to force people into a very difficult discretionary land use process. So I encourage you to fix this, and let's not let this become another new front in the land use wars that are really a plague on this county. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. I will now call on Johnny Mogstad. Johnny, it looks like you put your hand down, but you did have it up for public comment. I will unmute your microphone, and if you'd like to give public testimony, you may begin. You are unmuted.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to come to your meeting this afternoon. My name is Joni Mogstad. I live on Old Dillard Road in Southeast Eugene. I own property in Cresswell, in the Cresswell area. And that's where I first got involved with this, is having to do with the Cresswell property. I have a lot of difficulty reading through this plan and reading through the land code that supports the plan. And then you can go on further to FEMA documents that support the plan and that kind of thing. The whole document, and I've written this down for you, in my opinion, is written in a way that discourages my friends, my neighbors, the farmers around me from even trying to participate in this process. And if your goal is to be welcoming and want your constituents to come to you for help, rather than going to attorneys and to engineers to prepare themselves to ask intelligent questions because they don't understand the documents. I mean, it's really, really difficult. And I just want to tell you that from a layman standpoint, that to try to wade through this stuff is very difficult. I'm a fairly smart person, and I'm having a heck of a time with this. And I just want to tell you that if you want your constituents to come to you for help and believe in what you're doing, you got to fix this so people can understand it when they read it. It's incredible to me. I have some difficulties with some of this stuff. On page 16.43 on the top of the page under interpretation, the little double I's in the parentheses says that the interpretation of this ordinance and all provisions are liberally construed in favor of the governing body. I don't know what that means. I hope somebody can tell me at some point what it means. Is there an assumption here that we've got winners and losers and this is an adversarial kind of a thing? And if so, who's the judge or who is the umpire? And aren't we all trying to work together to reach ultimate goals? So why do we need somebody liberally construed as being, in favor instead of just doing it all right together? I do want to thank you for deleting that part about storage for fill, that whole section, because that was really troubling for me, having only 3/4 of an acre of land. And if I want to put some fill dirt in my backyard to try to find a place to compensate for that. So I really am glad that you deleted that. I appreciate that a whole lot. I found another glitch last night, like in the middle of the night, and I don't know if it's too late to talk to you about it, but the section that speaks to mobile or modular homes, and you associate that with the section on the dollar limit for repair and reconstruction, it appears to me that we're being pretty discriminatory against low-income people who live in mobile home parks and modular home parks. I don't see the 20% thing as being nearly enough to replace an older, probably deteriorating modular home that might be worth $20,000. So you add 20% to that, and you're going to replace that fallen apart mobile home for $20,000 plus 20%. I mean, that's what it sounds like to me, is what the expectation is. But if I want to recycle that, I'm going to be limited on some of those homes to like $30,000 for my new home. And if you read through the other parts that tie into this, it doesn't work. The sections mix up apples and oranges in terms of how you compute the value. You've got the fair market value, the real market value, but then you're figuring cost of construction for replacing it. And that doesn't have anything to do with market value. The cost of construction is the materials and the labor and that kind of stuff. But somehow that market value is going to dictate how much you can spend on construction. And I don't know what this is all trying to accomplish. Where are we going to get with that? What's that going to be good for? What does that make better? I just don't get this stuff. Unless our goal is to restrict and limit development and construction, then I understand what we're doing here. But if it's to help the citizens of this county live better lives, I don't see how that's going to work.
Thank you for your public comment. Your timer has elapsed.
Okay, I've rattled enough.
Thank you. Chair Bernie, we did have one more hand go up while people were speaking. I will call now on Dawn Mogstad, and I will unmute your microphone and you may begin your public comment.
Hello?
Hello.
I don't know if I'm doing this right.
You are doing it right.
Okay, so you can hear me? All right. I wanted to comment on a couple of things. There are, as you already realized, because you're making the corrections, unintended consequences of this code language that people didn't realize were there. And that's why some of these things are getting fixed now. Even after these corrections, there'll be unintended consequences, things left out, things left in that harm people that nobody recognized until 3 years down the road when somebody has a specific project that they need to complete. So I would highly recommend that you expand the variance language to take that into account. Right now, the variance language is pretty limited, and there's things in the code that'll pop up that nobody knows what they mean, and people might need help in the future. Once this is set in stone, we're likely not going to be able to get staff to come and talk to you again and ask for corrections. So the only way to get around this is to expand the variance language that lets people do a few more things when we run into a wall, which is the code. Second thing, the outline of the house, we've been calling it footprint of the house. I don't know what footprint means. I still don't know what it means. Looking down on the house, it's the foundation of the house. Does it count the front and back porches of a manufactured home? When you put in a new manufactured home, they've got different doors. They've got different locations of the entry platforms that get into the houses. All of that comes into play, and 20% wouldn't even be enough to take care of this. I'm going to give you one example real quick that I'm looking at. The original setback was 15 feet off the right-of-way. Code now says they have to set back 20 feet off the right-of-way. The home, a 20-foot wide home, moving it back that far, you're already losing 100 feet of the allowance. So if you're only allowed 20% expansion of the footprint, you lose 100 feet of that just needing to meet code that changed sometime in the last 50 years that the property owners had nothing to do with. So if we're going to talk about the footprint, or better yet, call it the outline of the house, I don't know what to call it, it should be at least a 30% allowance. Let's see, what else have I got here? There's language in the floodway section that that was changed. That's the specific language has to do with the hydrologic and hydraulic analysis performed in accordance with standard engineering practice. And sorry for getting ahead of myself here. This is section under floodways. That's subsection 4, floodways on page 701. I'm looking at 10701. I guess I could scroll up to 244, but I think it's the same. On 10-701, floodways, located within the special flood hazard areas. The following encroachments may be permitted if you get certification demonstrating hydraulic and hydrologic analysis performed in accordance with standard engineering practice. That language has been twisted around lots of different directions in the last 5 years. And I don't know what it means now, and I don't think any of you know what it means, and planning staff may or may not be able to tell you what that means. In 2018, it meant spending approximately $2,000 and a day's worth of work to help somebody replace a house. In 2019, 2020, it meant spending $10,000 to $15,000, tens of thousands of dollars, and more than a week's worth of time to help somebody replace a house. I don't know what it'll mean in the future. I don't know what it'll mean with respect to minimal development, such as fences or gazebos or retaining walls, which is section E of this same floodway subsection. There's no way to know what that means. No state, no county, no federal standards have changed since 2018. And a personal preference from a FEMA employee has changed that language to require somebody, instead of spending $2,000 to replace their house, to spend up to $20,000 to replace their house. And it's just a personal
Thank you
preference.
for your public comment. Your timer has expired.
Okay.
At this time, I do not have anyone else who's registered for the meeting with their hand raised. If you would like an opportunity to present public testimony for this agenda item, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. If not, we will turn the meeting back to Chair Burney. Chair Burney, I do not see any. Oh, I do see one more hand. Mary Phipps has raised her hand. Mary, I will unmute your microphone and you may begin your public comment.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
She said, my name is Mary Phipps. I'm a CPA in Eugene, Oregon. I live at 91039 Sunderman Road in the Mohawk Valley, Springfield, Oregon. And I also wanted to encourage the board to consider the variance issue because as the gentleman before me mentioned, there are issues that don't fit the criteria that have kind of come into play with the proposed changes. Just our particular property there's a bit of a discrepancy in definitions between FEMA's rules and Lane County's rules, and a simple, it seems simple to have the planners rule on this, but there's no leeway for that. So with some kind of discretionary allowance for planners to say, yes, we know what the letter of the law is, but this doesn't really apply in this case, or this property isn't impacting floodways and floodwaters in this case. Give them the discretionary language that allows them to rule in favor of a homeowner where there's no damage to be done. In our particular case, the property or the floodwater that would be displaced in a flood on our property is equivalent to a 5-gallon bucket. That's the area that of floodwater we would displace, and yet we fall under these rules and have been unable for 3 years to get a building permit. You have to give them discretionary language. You have to give the county the leeway to rule, to make a rational ruling. I thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I yield back to the commission.
Thank you for your public comment. At this time, I see no additional hands raised, so I will return the meeting back to you, Chair Burney.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for your public comments. Stay tuned because now it's time for staff to provide additional comments and hopefully respond to some of them and provide us some clarity. Ms. Searslaw.
Thank you, Chair Burney. I do want to provide some response to the written comment that we received, and then I will do my best to address some of the comments that we just heard. Some comment was submitted to the record asking for an emergency clause be added for this code amendment, which would make it effective immediately instead of 30 days after adoption. And if that's an option that the board is interested in, I have that language available so that it could be read into the motion today, if that's an option that you all want to pursue. There's some comments from Ms. Monroe, who I believe is in support of excluding farm structures from the higher ground provision. And that record, or that letter, has been provided to the record and provided to you. And then I'd like to speak to Mr. Gilardi's comments. He provided some written testimony and his verbal testimony regarding the hazardous materials issue and how that relates to critical facilities. This topic was before you during the adoption of Ordinance 2008, and I believe we had, or the board had, some similar discussion was had at that time and similar testimony was provided at that time. And the board determined to keep that reference of hazardous materials in the critical facilities definition. So staff hasn't identified that as needing a correction at this point. But if the board wants to address that issue raised in the comments, then staff is happy to do some additional research and see if we can address that, or yes, so I'll leave that at that. And then Mr. Bowerman provided some comments mainly concerned with protecting riparian areas and in opposition to the minimal development and footprint expansion in the floodway. And I just want to speak to a little bit the purpose of the floodplain code, and mainly that this code is focused on protecting life safety from flood hazard, and the purpose of the code is not riparian protection. There's a different section of Lane Code that protects riparian areas, and I believe his comments were specific to inclusion of bank stabilization as minimal development. And so I just wanted to make clear the purpose of the floodplain code, and that any bank stabilization would also have to meet the regulations that govern riparian areas and protect protected streams. And just to expand a bit more, respond a bit more to his comments, staff understood that the prohibition on development in the floodway was mainly for the purpose of life safety and preventing new and habitable development from being located in the floodway. And the reality is that there is existing residential and other development currently in the floodway, and staff believe that property owners should be able to minimally expand where it doesn't put lives at risk. And so that's why we're proposing that minimal development in the floodway. And again, I'll note that even something classified as minimal development, it's still development in the floodway and would be subject to the no rise and engineer analysis requirements that are applicable to development in the floodway. In response to Ms. Mogstad's comments, I do wish that the code could be more comprehensible to lay people. Unfortunately, this is we have followed a model code from FEMA and from the Department of Land Conservation and Development. So there's only a certain level of changes that we can make to the language to make it more understandable. And on that same vein, some other comments raised expanding the variance language, and this language also is pretty guided by the model code, and I'm not sure how that could be amended or what ability staff has to amend that and still stay in compliance with the minimum NFIP standards. But that is something that we could look into if that's something the board wanted to pursue. And then in response to Mr. Mogstad's comments, I just wanted to speak to the comment about the hydraulic and hydrologic analysis. Specifically, the language in the code requires that any development in the floodway must be certified as not creating a rise via an analysis, hydraulic and hydrologic analysis in accordance with standard engineering practices. And my understanding that this is a step backwater analysis, would be required to demonstrate this, and there is guidance from FEMA very specifically detailing what sort of analysis and what sort of evidence and information needs to be included in that analysis in order to meet this criteria. So that's what we require, and we follow that FEMA guidance when we are processing those floodway applications. And just from a quick review of my notes, I think that's what I can address at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to remind the board before we have discussion, after hearing all this, that we have 5 options for action. We can adopt the ordinance as written, or direct staff to modify the ordinance and bring that back for adoption, or close the hearing but leave the record open, or continue the hearing to a date and time specified and certain, or take no action. So with that as a context, do commissioners want to weigh in, ask questions, provide input? Commissioner Bozievich.
Thank you. A couple of questions for staff, because I was the one that brought up the footprint issue. Mr. Mogstad brought it up also. It is a difficult thing because footprint is not defined in our code anywhere specifically. And staff has kind of been looking at it as the aerial view of a house foundation, because questions like, well, if I put gutters on a house, does that add to the footprint or not? And said, no, that doesn't change the footprint. But there are some questions about that, because when you think about particularly some of these manufactured homes and replacing them or resettling them, the home might be currently perpendicular to the direction of flow in a floodway. And then if you replace it parallel to the direction of flow, it actually has much lower impact. But turning it 90 degrees to the existing footprint may actually get outside of that existing footprint by more than 20% with the exact same size house. So I'm kind of questioning, how is that 20% increase in size, or does it have to be 20% within, no more than 20% outside the existing footprint? That phrase that in the proposed language that staff brought forward does not expand footprint of the structure by more than 20%. First, we still never defined footprint. And does that 20%, is that limited to the increase in footprint, or is that how much you can be outside of that with the, and still keep the same square footage? That's not clear to me. So I'm a little.
If I could answer that, I think we had that question too when we were trying to draft some of this language to respond to that comment, and so we have separated those two standards. So you can expand the footprint by not more than 20%, and then the second provision allows you to locate it on the same footprint as the existing structure, or partially within that footprint. So our thought was that it can be expanded by 20%, or in the situation that you're describing, it could be rotated or shifted anywhere within that existing footprint.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification, because I wasn't quite getting that reading the actual language. Secondary to that, because it doesn't actually say what footprint is. So I have an existing manufactured home, and it's, most of them are built on piers. I keep the same size piers, elevate the home up above 2 feet above 100-year flood elevation, but then cantilever additional square footage out over the floodplain. My actual disturbance of the floodplain hasn't changed. Is that allowable to increase the square footage of the building on a cantilever over the floodplain?
Well, would that be, are you asking if that would be allowable within the 20%, or are you asking if?
Yeah, is that is your footprint the actual, look down square footage of the house? Roof?
That is how we've been interpreting it, is where the structure meets the ground.
But if the piers are the only thing meeting the ground, does that cantilever portion count? I mean, this is a legitimate question because I've been asked this by whether or not cantilever structures impinge on the floodplain.
If they are not touching the ground, I don't think so. I don't know if I have a clear answer for you.
Okay, that's part of why I think there needs to be somewhere in our code a definition of footprint.
So I did discuss a little bit some of the nuances around adding a definition to this code, and it does have to do with the noticing requirements because we did not send about Measure 56 notice for this project. So unfortunately, I don't know if that's something that we can accomplish under this code amendment project. Okay,
maybe for a future one, that's just something to put in staff's mind for future work plan. So that answers some of my questions around that. My other question is, if we're requiring engineering analysis and basically a no rise for any improvements, why are we making an allowance for habitat restoration projects to have rise? Why are we even exempting that?
Because that's something that's specifically allowed. And I believe it was an option in the model ordinance, a higher regulatory standard that staff proposed in the last ordinance. And it was incorporated in that last ordinance. What wasn't incorporated was an explicit allowance for habitat restoration projects that do not create a rise, since all development from the floodway is now prohibited except for those few exceptions. And so just for a matter of clarity, we think it should be added as an explicit allowance to make it clear that a habitat enhancement and restoration project would be allowed in the floodway. As for why one that creates a rise would be allowed, it's our and FEMA's understanding that there are projects that have benefits on habitats, riparian habitats that might create a rise, and those should still be allowed and not prohibited in the floodway.
Yeah, I'm good with that too. But our flood ordinance is about life safety, not habitat. We just had that discussion earlier. If it creates a rise, I believe we should require some kind of study or something that shows that there's not that rise does not create a life safety issue. Yes,
I believe, and I haven't looked at that specific criterion a bit, but I do believe there's a criteria under that section that requires analysis that shows that there won't be any negative impact on structures in the floodplain.
Excellent. I just want to make sure that, because I'm familiar with some habitat restoration that's been done that shortly after it was done, the opposite side of the river started eroding. So I'm a little bit leery about us just blindly giving allowance for habitat restoration, particularly when it comes to life safety. So if indeed we still require engineering analysis and demonstration of no life safety issues for habitat restoration projects that create rise, I'm good with that. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yes, so I did just pull up the language so I could tell you definitively, and there is a criteria that requires no existing structures will be negatively impacted by the proposed activity. And then they also do have to go through a conditional letter of map amendment process to actually revise the maps when there's a rise in the flood levels and a change in the flood levels.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. And I'll, when time comes, I think I've got an idea of a motion that we can collect some of this stuff together. So I appreciate the clarifications.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. There's a lot here to contemplate, and I just want to note that we gave it 60 minutes today, and we're 3 minutes to 60 minutes, and there's a lot of us that still haven't been able to speak. I would ask fellow commissioners if we could move this to a third reading. I want to have some time to review the information that was sent to us from the public that was emailed to us, and to review and think about everything that's been presented today. The one thing that I think I'm most concerned about is it's partially this footprint definition, which I think is a really important point, because if we're considering adding a variance of 20%, it's 20% of the footprint, which doesn't have a definition. That's a challenge for me to blindly say, okay, we'll do 20% variance, but a variance on something that's undefined. Don't get me wrong. I think that there are important reasons for variances in development. Sometimes situations occur where it makes sense to have those available. But I would like us to be pretty darn clear about what we do and do not want to approve. If it's simply square footage of a building, say you have a 2,000 square foot home, you add 20%, that's 400 more square feet. That is possibly 2 more bedrooms with 2 more people, 2 more life safety reasons to consider the code language extra carefully, since this is about life and safety in floodways, and we have had, our share of floods. There's probably more here I'd like to go over, but I feel like we just need more time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And before I call on Vice Chair Farr, Commissioner Buck, just to clarify, did you just make a suggestion that we continue the hearing to a date and time certain?
Yes, that was my suggestion.
Okay, thank you very much for the, yes, Vice Chair Farr.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. A couple of things really quickly. I would agree with Commissioner Buck on continuing to a time and date certain. I'll wait to hear what that time and date are. But regarding moving it forward, it seems that there is at least one thing, and I'm anxious to hear what Commissioner Bozovich's motion will do to accommodate this. And that is the language that you provided on page 2 of 3 in the View Today's material, which is on lane code 16.244, and it's in red. And it looks as though we do need to add that language today to include it in the third reading. And that is the language that does not expand the footprint of the structure by more than 20%, etc. I think that you've helped define it through Commissioner Bozovich's question regarding what that means in terms of orientation to the actual footprint, that it can be, it can cover part of the existing footprint, and the square footage of the actual footprint doesn't necessarily have to be exactly in the same orientation to the flow of the flood water, for instance. So I think you've explained that in ways that make it clear to me. The other thing that I hope I'm clear on is that what you've said regarding the definition of footprint, while it is vague, we are using where the building touches the ground as the general definition that we're using for footprint. That is where the building actually touches the ground. So if you have a deck that is, as Commissioner Bozovich designed by perhaps Frank Lloyd Wright, and it cantilevers out a ways, that's not part of the footprint. That is, the footprint is actually where it touches the ground. Is that correct?
If I may chime in here, Amber Bell, Planning Director. So
Thank you.
as Rachel has mentioned, so there is not a definition of footprint, unfortunately, and we did look to add one to help to clarify this issue. However, part of the challenge that we encountered is because here we're proposing clarifications to the code. We had to look into whether a Measure 56 notice was required. That would be required for any more restrictive language. And working with County Council, and perhaps County Council would like to weigh in on this. But as we understand, the provisions that are being proposed at this time didn't warrant a Measure 56 notice. However, adding a definition could potentially require a Measure 56 notice. So we would have to re-notice to any property in the floodplain and provide them that specific notice if we were to look back to define what the definition of footprint is. However, when there is not a specified term, Chapter 16090 definitions does specify that we can look to the ordinary meaning or to the Webster's definition of a term that's undefined. In this case, we looked into that, and that means an area that's occupied or affected by something. I'm paraphrasing, that's not an exact definition. So I believe why we can't specifically answer the question of whether a cantilevered structure, whether that cantilevered portion would be within the footprint is because we would have to look at the design of a structure on a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, a cantilevered structure could be looked to as what's ordinary, or excuse me, what's occupied or affected, but it might largely depend on how it's designed, whether it's on piers that impact the ground and create an impact or occupy part of the floodway. So
that did not make it much easier for Joni Mongstad or me to understand. So the trying to make it easier for people to understand, you say we go back to Webster's definition, an impression of the foot on a surface. And so that is, doesn't matter what my arms are doing, my footprint is where my feet touch the ground. And so that's the Webster's definition. So if that's what we're going by, then my arms are cantilevered out from my body. So that's a part of the Webster's definition. My feet are touching the ground, my arms are cantilevered out. So that's what I would contend. But that's not the point I want to make. Really, I'm going specifically back to revising the second reading in order to make it to incorporate what we need to in the third reading for a less down the road discussion. You're suggesting that the board may want to add the red highlighted item from Lane Code 16.244 by more than 20%, etc. That's correct? Is that Mr. Suslove?
Yes, that would have to be read into the motion or referenced in the motion in order to avoid having two more readings of the ordinance. If this was read in today, then there would just be one additional reading.
Then I am not going to use my cantilevered arms to try and amend it on the fly. I'm going to wait for Commissioner Bozovich's potential motion, which I think will probably incorporate that. But I'm interested in making certain that footprint does not necessarily mean, however you end up defining the footprint, whether it's the Webster's definition or some definition that nobody will ever understand, which is where we are right now, that it can be adjusted. It doesn't have to be the exact orientation of the footprint, as long as it covers part of the footprint and does not exceed the footprint by more than 20% of the square footage of the footprint. So that's what I'm understanding you to have said. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I've heard you say.
So just to reiterate, this provision would allow you to expand the structure by 20%. And then in addition to that, you could also relocate the structure or reorient the structure so that it's partially on the same footprint. And how this is written, or the intent of how this was written, was to not set a percentage limitation when you are shifting or reorienting on the footprint. So the 20% only applies to expanding the area of the structure.
That is pretty much what I said in slightly different words. So then the question remains whether we're going to use the Webster's definition of where my foot touches the ground, regardless of what my arms are doing. That's for a later discussion. The other question that I quickly have is, you said 20%. Mr. Mungstad said, why not 30%? Well, why not 30%?
Yes, so that could definitely be a policy question for the board. I did look at some other examples of floodplain codes from other counties. I saw examples of 10%. I saw examples of 20%. I also did look at, I think this, just to give a little additional background, I think this issue is coming up in the replacement of manufactured homes, since when you're purchasing a manufactured home, the area of that and the configuration of that is static as compared to a stick-built structure. And so I did look at some dimensions and configurations of older manufactured homes as compared to what you would or are able to purchase today for a manufactured home. And I found that most would fall within that 20% difference. Most. I can't give you assurance that every situation would be covered by that 20%. And so that might be something that the board wants to consider, but that was what I found.
That is a great response, Rachel, and you gave me a good response to my question, because that in conjunction with the fact that it does not have to fit exactly in the same orientation should cover most situations, I would think. Chair Bernie, that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Trieger, did you have anything on this? No? Commissioner Buck has identified one path forward. I know that Commissioner Bozovich, you'd like to speak because we are over, but please, Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. So I appreciate Commissioner Buck's misgivings about moving ahead with language that really hasn't been debated well, and we don't have a definition, and putting a definition at this point would maybe send us back to square A and starting over at Planning Commission. Understanding that, and understanding that there are people right now that cannot finish the permitting process for their homes because we still have the compensatory storage language in the code, and a few other the clarifications that staff proposed originally and have gone all the way through the Planning Commission. I would like to, the board will agree to this later, under agenda setting items, have a task to move further on with additional clarifications of our floodplain ordinance. But this time, I would like to move the second reading of ordinance number 2107 as read in the first reading, and continuing the public hearing to a third reading and public hearing. And I don't know if staff has suggested a time and date for a third reading and hearing. If they have one, I can.
I have identified October 19th as a continued public hearing date and third reading.
Wish it weren't that far out. And the only reason why I want another reading is I want to add the emergency clause. So it'd be the third reading and public hearing for ordinance number 2107 in the matter of amending lane code 16244 floodplain combining zone and LC 10271 floodplain combining district, and adopting a savings and severability clause and declaring an emergency, because there are people that need this language to be effective immediately. And if even the 19th is still about 30 days out, okay, hold on. I'm sorry, Chair, I have to rethink this because the date they're giving us is so far out, it may be just best to pass the ordinance as is now. Is the 19th at the absolute soonest we can get this back to the board?
This is Amber Belligan. I'm looking at and I don't know whether there's availability on the 12th, but we are routing process for the board packet if we address any comments and provide an additional board packet, would be due this Friday. The next available meeting is the October 19th meeting. So I'm not sure if, again, if the 12th is available and if that provides Rachel the time that she needs to prepare her packet.
So I guess I'm looking towards the agenda team and Diana Jones. Is the 12th available? Because I'm proposing.
I'm with you, Commissioner. I'm with you 100%. Ms. Jones, is the 12th available or not?
Yes, the 12th is available. I have to defer to Rachel if she can meet that deadline, though.
That was my next question. Ms. Scherslaw?
I guess my question is, what if there are revisions being requested to the ordinance at this point?
I am proposing no changes other than adding an emergency clause is what I'm trying to do.
Then that should be, the 12th should be fine.
If I may, Commissioner?
Thank you.
And just a sec, Vice Chair. Commissioner Buck, is that consistent with your intent?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Commissioner Farr, please, and then I'd like to call the question and if we could move.
Well, we haven't had a second yet either.
And I'm prepared to second the motion, Chair Bernie. That's why I raised my hand. However, I'll put this to Ms. Bell and to the maker of the motion. The item in red, adding the 20% and footprint language, seems like that would be wouldn't add any time to the preparation of the ordinance. Is that something you could do and still make that 12th deadline? And I would propose that as an amendment to your motion, Jay, to include that if it does not extend beyond the emergency limit that you're citing.
I was waiting for surf.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't know if that was directed for me. I don't have to make any, no, I don't have to write any new code language if that's being included. So that's a fine for me and to do it on the 12th.
So Jay, if you could add that verbatim, it wouldn't affect your timing, and I will second the motion.
Yeah, Commissioner Farr, I specifically did not include that because I believe that Commissioner Buck has an issue with that language and would want to possibly wordsmith it, which would add much more time. My concern is to adopt the changes as quickly as possible for those people stuck in the permit process right now.
Then I'll second the motion as made. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
Commissioner Buck, did you still want to speak? Commissioner Bozovich, you read that correctly. I'm going to call the question, although I am going to make one quick comment. I agree with some of the comments. This stuff is so difficult for the layperson to read. By the way, I'm the layperson too. and so I appreciate the discussion. One of the comments made had to do with 20% impacting cost, not footprint. Could we get clarification? That 20% did not relate to cost, correct? It only related to footprint.
I do not know what that comment was in relation to, but I also received a written comment from her with the same information. So I've reached out to see if I can clarify with her on what that comment addresses.
Thank you. Commissioner Bozovich, if you would restate your motion with the date and time certain, we'll get.
Sure, but I will just clarify that 20% on cost they're talking about, there's another section of the code that talks about what is a significant improvement and when you have what actually trips having to make a floodplain approval, and part of that is any improvements that are more than 20% of the value.
Thank you.
And when you're replacing a manufactured home, it's very difficult to do that for less than 20% of the original value versus a stick build.
Yep.
That's a completely different section of the code.
Thank you, Commissioner. I apologize.
But I am moving the second reading and continuing the public hearing and setting a third reading and public hearing for ordinance number 2107 in the matter of amending Lane Code 16244 floodplain combining zone and LC 10271 floodplain combining district, and adopting savings and severability clause, and adding, in addition to the staff's recommendations from the first reading, an emergency clause to the ordinance.
And that has been seconded by Commissioner Farr. All those, is there any further discussion on the motion? God, I hope not. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? And the motion passes unanimously, 5 votes to 0. Thank you, everyone, very much. We are now on Commissioner business. A, announcements. B, future board assignment requests. 16A, announcements. I see no announcements. Future board assignment requests. I expected Commissioner Bozovich's hand, but I see Commissioner Farr's hand.
Thank you. This was telegraphed during the presentation this morning by on the Housing and Homelessness Report. The Lane County COAD has recommended to the Poverty and Homelessness Board that we form a, they're calling it a disaster response team. I'm sorry that I'm a little bit stumbling on my exact words on that, but the language is coming from the Poverty and Homelessness Board, and it'll come to the administrator. And bear with me just one second. But it's coming from the COAD, and it's an emergency response team. The COAD is an organization of agencies. We all know this, many of us know this in Lane County, that really reaches broadly beyond government and into private industry and to many of our nonprofits to help us to identify when emergencies are surfacing, including heat emergencies, smoke emergencies, potentially flood emergencies, and inclement weather or harsh weather emergencies. So this, Mr. Mokrzycki, this is a request that you take the request that's going to come from the Poverty and Homelessness Board and add it to a future agenda item to create a emergency response task force. And bear with me.
Can I just, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Farr, can I just try to understand that a little bit better? So the request is there's going to be a request coming from a Poverty and Homelessness Board to create a task force focused on. They're calling it a hazardous weather task force, and it's going to be prescribed by from the Poverty and Homelessness Board, and it's designed to have a multi-agency team that is considering how to respond to emergencies that include either natural events or just typical winter weather. And the reason for it is that, for instance, we have the Egan Warming Center. The Egan Warming Center is restricted by St. Vincent de Paul's capacity to manage it, and also by the number of sites that we have where we actually place the Egan Warming Center. This would go beyond simply the warming centers and help put in place a system that is more rapid response, making it easier for you as the administrator to step into an unexpected emergency. So it'd be a multi-agency group, and I'm wondering is the request to bring that request to the board for a discussion, or to actually just create the group?
It would be to make a recommendation to create the group and then bring it to the board. Then bring that recommendation to the board. Sarai Johnson would be a staff person who has much of the language necessary for this, and it would be in conjunction with the Lane County COAD.
So this is a future board. This is a request. Okay.
It is, yes.
Steve?
Yeah, I think maybe why I'm struggling is just thinking that it would be helpful to see the request in order to determine what the next right step would be, whether it's a work session with the board or discussion with the agenda team. But maybe we can take the request and then discuss it with the agenda team and then determine what the best step after that is.
That is it. And I'm sorry, Ms. Mokrowski, I have my notes absolutely perfectly written, and I cannot find the notes that I have perfectly written.
So, Vice Chair, we're taking your word for it that these are perfectly written.
Well, they are so immaculately written with so much input from experts.
Okay. I'm sorry, Vice Chair, are you through?
I am, yes. That was pretty stumbly, and it's the Lane County Community Organizations Active in Disaster to bring together a broad array of community organizations to foster an effective response in times of disaster. I'll send you that in writing, Steve Mokrowski.
Thank you, sir. Are there any other future or assignment requests or commissioner business? Oh, yes, Commissioner. Commissioner too late. Yes, Commissioner Trieger.
Are you?
Commissioner, no, I apologize. Commissioner Trieger had her hand up first. Commissioner Trieger. We can't hear you, Commissioner. Well, Commissioner Bozievich, do you want to wait? My guess is your request might take a little while, but it's up to you, sir. Well, I'm sure Commissioner Trieger will be right back. You've only been waiting 6 hours.
Are you referring to the agenda team request relative to floodplains or the motion that I wanted to make under emergency business previously?
I was assuming the latter, but really commissioner business is where at the time as chair I suggested that would be appropriate, which we're at now. But Commissioner Trieger is back. So
I do have an agenda team request also relative to the floodplain ordinance.
Why don't you do that? Then we'll go to Commissioner Trieger, then we'll go back to you.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, for head nods to direct planning staff to continue with development of a definition for footprint for our floodplain ordinance, and also to at that same point look into some of the other issues that were brought up in written and verbal comments around variances for replacement dwellings, and also the issue of hazardous materials relative to the critical facilities. If there's a better definition or something more clear, a more clear and objective standard we can use. Those particular issues that were brought up that I don't think we want to try and wrestle with to clarify the issues that were brought forward through Planning Commission this round of correcting the floodplain ordinance. But just if I can get head nods to ask staff to continue working on our floodplain ordinance.
You got me, especially as a footprint, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. I saw 2+ years, Commissioner head nods. Commissioner Trieger. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Buck. Okay, Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you. Am I with you?
You are totally with us.
I'm with you. I'm not with it, but I'm with you. This is the second time today and the third time in the last 4 meetings that my microphone mutes itself and I have to log off and back on. So I don't know what's happening. This is less a new assignment than a requesting to make an adjustment to a previous assignment that I know is in the works in service to making more efficient use of staff time and hopefully our conversation. And it's regarding the polystyrene ban ordinance. Mr. Mokrowski was away and we got head nods to move forward and ask for a work session on the polystyrene issue broadly, and specifically, I had made the request for a draft ordinance, but I would like to make sure that our work session is broader, and that then if what comes out of that work session is an ordinance, it's more appropriately targeted and worded and has the right timeline. So I would like to keep the assignment that we have a work session on polystyrene, and that it includes discussion of the impact of the product stewardship bill, the Senate Bill 582. We had talked about Alex Kyler coming to talk to us about whether or how that legislation will impact what advocates are asking for, specifically around food service grade polystyrene. But that way also the work session can be more broad about polystyrene's impact on the waste stream, on our landfill. And that way, if what we want to do is an ordinance where we have more information so that we have a more targeted ordinance, whether it's a public health centered on impacts on human health, whether it's about environmental impacts, and whether it's still necessary based on this product stewardship bill at all. So just asking to have support to adjust that assignment to continue to, or to still have the work session as soon as possible on the issue of polystyrene, and leave out asking staff to prepare a draft ordinance as part of that work session.
Head nods.
Great, thank you.
I don't want to presume anything, but Commissioner Bozievich, did you want to? Now, Commissioner, now you're muted.
If we are finished with agenda team requests and moving on to other commissioners' business, I kind of wish we.
Let's make sure you're right. Are we through with agenda team requests now? Please, Commissioner, I'm sorry.
Okay. I kind of wish we had dealt with this early on under emergency business. It would have been more transparent to deal with it at the beginning of the meeting when we have the public's attention and their audience. But we can deal with it now. I believe that we unintentionally violated public meetings laws in our September 1st and September 9th executive sessions. And the remedy to that is to make those sessions public. And I believe, it's pretty clear we made a decision. We walked in without revealing the executive session materials, so I have to talk in very many generalities, but we started the session with 5 options. And we ended the last session with 1 option and a draft policy written. I don't think it's hard to say that we did not make a decision of some kind in that session. Therefore, I move the Lane County Board of Commissioners waive the confidentiality granted by Oregon Public Meetings Law for the September 1, 2021 and the September 9, 2021 Lane County Board of Commissioners executive sessions that were conducted pursuant to ORS 1926612 and 2D, thereby making the content of those meetings available for review and discussion by this board and the public. Included in this motion is a limited waiver of attorney-client privilege for those 2 meetings only. This motion is not intended to waive any other privilege or confidentiality granted by law.
Thank you, Commissioner. Before we call for any discussion, is there a second?
Second.
Okay. I don't dare repeat your motion, but it's been moved and seconded. And I think we get the gist. Discussion. Or before, if I may, unless it's inappropriate here, I mean, so much is changing. Mr. Mokrihisi, is any need to discuss changes yet, or is that really not germane to the motion on the table?
I'm happy, Chair, to provide an update for the board on the process to date, and certainly what's transpired in the last week in terms of release of the policy and discussions with bargaining units. So if you'd like to hear an update, I'm happy to do that.
Commissioner Bozievich, would you mind that? I mean,
I actually believe that's not germane to the motion.
Okay. No,
I made the motion because my initial service on this board saw me settling a lawsuit around public meetings laws that cost this county $1.5 million. And then I was subsequently sued, not successfully, for supposedly violating public meeting laws. I have a lot of sensitivity around this issue. And my concern is if we do not make those meetings public where we made a decision, doesn't matter what the decision was about or what's changed since we made that decision, we made a decision in those meetings. Those meetings should be made public, or we set ourselves up for potential liability. I asked at the end of the meetings to go back out in a public session, was denied. I've been trying to make this as soon as possibly public because I do not want to be personally liable for violating public meetings law. 2 of our commissioners paid $20,000 fines over this. So I am, you know, it doesn't matter what's changed around the decision and impact since then. It's about the fact that we made a decision in executive session, something that is not allowed. And those executive sessions should be made public because they also included deliberations towards that decision.
So duly noted. So let's get some input, and if I may, settle down a little. I think we're talking apples, oranges, and I appreciate that not only did you make a motion, but you provided a solution to your concern. Is there any, correct? Is there any discussion towards this motion? Yes, Commissioner Buck.
I'd like to hear from our county council on this particular item.
I'm going to turn on my camera. There it is. Oops. This is not without precedent. The board has waived attorney confidentiality and attorney-client privilege in the past when the board thinks it's appropriate. I think the most recent example that I can think of is when I believe there's a work session that was held around the aerial spray measure. I think that was the last time that was done, but there was attorney-client that involved disclosure of attorney-client privilege, discussing potential liability, which is typically not done in a public session without the concurrence of at least 3 of the members. It's the long-standing policy of the board that not a single commissioner has the ability to waive attorney-client privilege. It must be by a majority of the board.
Excuse me, was that your question, Commissioner Buck?
No, actually, I'm more interested in the merits of the actual motion itself, that the allegations that we made decisions in executive session that should have been made in public. I believe that's the crux of it. And it was my understanding that the executive session was covered by the rules and regulations in which you can have an executive session.
Without getting into all the details, I've reviewed over the last day or so the executive sessions, and I believe they were appropriate. But I understand that Commissioner Bozievich respectfully disagrees, and that doesn't mean that someone wouldn't agree with him.
And yes, Vice Chair Farr.
Thanks, Chair Bernier. And I did second this motion. I'm really aware of Commissioner Bozievich's sensitivity. Commissioner Bozevich and I have not talked about this at all, but quite frankly, I participated in that discussion believing at the time, and I adhere to that belief, that we were inside of the rules of executive session. We did not deliberate to a decision from my point of view. So once again, I feel the pain of Commissioner Bozievich's sensitivity. And even though Handy and Sorensen paid fines based upon extracurricular meetings that were not executive session, it was, I do understand it because it's so close to Commissioner Bozievich's participation as a county commissioner prior to my days. So I believe that I personally believe that we were inside the rules based on my analysis of it. I'm not an attorney, but that is my personal lay analysis that we were inside the rules when we were in executive session at the time. Consequently, Commissioner Bozievich, with apologies, I probably am not going to vote in favor of the motion that I seconded.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are there any other commissioners? I see your hand, Commissioner Buck. I was just seeing if anyone who hadn't spoken yet wanted to. Okay, please, Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. This is a question for County Council. We have executive sessions in order to protect people. Who are we protecting? Who could be involved in this particular subject? And why would we be doing that? And why do we do that in executive session?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Who are we protecting?
The reasons that we have executive session are generally because we are discussing issues in which we are protecting individuals who may or may not be discussed. In this case, when we have executive session for these particular circumstances, who are we protecting?
Under the provision that this was specifically used, you mean the one that was used for these sessions? I don't think it's protecting an individual, it's protecting the process. There was discussion about the potential responses to the impacts of bargaining and those sorts of things. So maybe, for example, in taking it in a different context, when we discuss potential litigation, we may not necessarily be talking about protecting a specific individual, but the interests of the county. Now, there may be an individually named defendant, but generally speaking, that's what it was. But in the past, like I said, it isn't without precedent. The privilege belongs to the board, and the board can choose to waive it.
Thank you, Commissioner. And yes, Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you. And for clarification, if I'm understanding, Commissioner Bozievich is alleging that we essentially took a vote and came to a decision, as opposed to what we do in executive session, which is discuss a topic so as to air questions, concerns, and so that the county administrator can understand where the board comes at a given issue, but it was not, there was no vote taken. And it seems to me, if I'm understanding his concern, is that we made as a body, that we took a vote on something in an executive session. And that seems to me the crux of this. And is that accurate, Commissioner Bozievich? That's your assertion?
You know, there's many ways to make a decision with a quorum present. Doesn't always have to be a vote, but we did make a decision and deliberated towards it in executive session with a quorum present, which is, in my reading, a violation of public meetings law. I also raised the objection that I believed that the executive session was not addressing an item under that particular exemption of labor negotiations, because the only thing that was really talked about labor negotiations wise was we were notified that the topic of discussion could be a mandatory subject of bargaining, and a demand to bargain could follow pending what decision we made. But no discussion during the executive session of how we would deal with that, or what might be asked, or any negotiating items that would actually be normally privileged under that particular executive session item. I don't believe there was anything discussed in that executive session that couldn't be made public. That's one of the reasons why I'm asking for it to be made public. But I do believe we did deliberate towards a decision on a policy that the public is very interested in. And had we not seen agreement of a majority of a quorum of the board with that policy, it would have been different. So I don't think there's any way somebody can objectively go back and review those tapes and say we did not make a decision when we started out with a presentation of 5 options and ended up picking one, and then having draft policy developed, and then basically consenting to that draft policy. It just doesn't pass the smell test to me. It's not transparent. I don't think anyone's harmed by making this public, and the limited waiver of attorney-client privilege. It's the transparent thing to do. It also provides us an affirmative defense in the future.
Commissioner Trieger, the floor is still yours. Oh, okay, you're good. Before we take a vote on this, I'd like to say that I personally have no problem releasing it. I don't, no problem whatsoever. I think Commissioner Bozievich, my opinion, I think you're dead wrong, but I also have no problem releasing it. You know, we're not supposed to talk about what occurs in the executive session, but my recollection is the administrator was asking for our input before the administrator made a decision. Pure and simple. But having said that, I have no problem voting yes on your request at all. In fact, I think if anything, it's going to demonstrate that that was the case. Yes, Vice Chair Farr.
Thank you. And Commissioner Bozievich's further explanation that the item, in his opinion, was not, didn't warrant executive session. I agree with that. I think it is something that we could put out in the open. It could have had the discussion in the open because it was just, once again, just an open-ended question, basically. However, I still don't believe we deliberated to a decision, but my decision to maybe vote on this motion to make it public is that because I don't think there's anything that was said in there that should not or could not have been handled outside of an executive session. I agree with you on that, Jay. So I guess I'll wait for the vote on that.
Do any other commissioners want to provide any other input on this before we call the question? Yes, Commissioner Trieger.
It's been a long day already. I know we still have things ahead of us, and I'm wrestling with this. In other instances in executive session, when we go into executive session, understanding it's an item that will require a decision, we know that we will have our deliberations, and then we will come out of executive session and take the action in public. That was not the way this executive session was sort of pitched to us or to the other people within this organization who participated. That executive session, folks did not go into that executive session. It wasn't just the Board of County Commissioners and the County Administrator participating. And so again, from County Council, I'd like to hear sort of the difference. If Commissioner Bozievich's aim is to have opinions of board members made public, that's very different, and there are ways to do that. If he has some other aim around making available the detail of the entirety of a conversation by making a recording public, that's something else. So I guess I'm looking to County Council to understand, what some of the options are here that can get at addressing issues of transparency, if in fact there are any, but also preserves the integrity of what people were expecting, the parameters of their conversation was under which they were happening.
Well, I don't know what would whether that would satisfy Commissioner Bozievich in terms of transparency. It's really a policy decision for the board. So clearly it's non-precedent setting. It's what I will say that it does lessen the risk. Again, I disagree with Commissioner Bozievich's assertion, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have the right to make that, and that it can't go further down there or further down the road on that process. And I will say that releasing the things does eliminate that risk. But it is, at the end of the day, it is a policy decision for the board.
May I ask another question, Chair?
Oh, what the heck? Of course you can.
Regarding the time sensitivity of this, while I do occasionally take notes and I do write down quotes, I don't always listen verbatim to what y'all say. I am responsible for what I say, but I don't listen verbatim to what y'all say. And I'm pretty convinced that I did not deliberate to a decision, but I don't know exactly what the rest of y'all said. So do we have a chance, would we have a chance to take a listen privately to the recording of the executive session, then come out and make the decision on as to whether or not to make it public next meeting?
I think you would have to ask the maker of the motion.
Yeah, thank you. And I am with maybe Mr. Dingell's backing.
Well, if I can, if the question is, does the board or can an individual board member listen to the executive session? The answer to that's absolutely yes. So there's no prohibition to that.
And the second part of that is, can we delay the vote on this motion?
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, Commissioner, that I hear sort of the solution you proposed being requested to be delayed but not disagreed with.
I have some misgivings with that. I kind of felt like we should have dealt with this very first thing this morning. I know that there may, some people may feel they didn't make a decision. I believe we unintentionally did. And I will try and go back and maybe walk you through that a little bit without discussing details. But we all know we had 5 options presented. Had we, as a board, a majority of us with a quorum present, disagreed with the option that the administrator was initially leaning towards, do you think he would have come to a different, if we'd had a different policy by the end of those executive sessions? You don't think so? We are the people that hire that administrator. And basically we were presented with options, and it turned out that a majority of this board with a quorum present agreed with a certain option, and that's what ended up being implemented. And to me, it's very difficult to argue that if the board had chosen, if the majority had agreed with a different option, that we would not have come out with that option, which to me says we made a choice in executive session on a policy, whether we actually took a formal vote or not. But actually at one point, there was wording said of 4-1 several times, both by the chair and the administrator. And I can go back to the tapes and find that, if we want to go back, if people want to go back and listen.
That's not the issue.
But I don't want to delay this vote. I feel so strongly about the public meetings issue and transparency. I don't want my house at risk. And I can't make any argument that I don't understand public meetings law. And I was unfortunately in that meeting, and just like Commissioner Stewart, who accidentally told somebody else how he felt about an issue prior to a vote, got found to be guilty of violating public meetings law just by saying, no, I won't vote for that. I just happen to accidentally be present where I think that there was a violation, which means I need that corrected as soon as possible, because I feel like my house is up for grabs.
So if I may, without being dramatic, the answer is no, you don't want to delay the vote. Okay. Is there any other discussion? I couldn't disagree more, but I'm going to vote to do it. I'm going to vote to go along with your solution. I don't know if I'll be in the minority or majority. I have no idea. But here's my concern. I'm not convinced, because this is apples and oranges. I remember when Commissioner Buck and I, before we came in, we read every bit of all of the details of public meeting law, and we were branded. I think our attorney can even share with you the degree to which I was, and to never violate that. So, and I appreciate, Commissioner, that you said you think it was unintentional, and that this is the solution. So I hope that that's the case. I hope this isn't a slippery slope that you're proposing as it relates to executive session. I hope that, and I mean this sincerely, I really hope there's no political motives here. I don't know, but again, I disagree. I think we were asking for advisement, and we were coalescing what the numbers that looked like. But again, I have no problem releasing releasing whatever these are called, the recording. So is it time for a vote, or does anyone else want to weigh in? Okay. Commissioner Bozievich, can I paraphrase your motion by saying all those in favor of releasing the recording of executive sessions on those 2 dates? And I don't have the dates in my head. Is that basically it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All those in favor of that, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Okay. I believe Commissioner Buck, you're a nay, correct? So the ayes have it. The motion passes 3 votes to 2.
May I ask a clarification? Sorry, Chair, I didn't hear your vote. Were you a yes vote?
Yes, I was.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the ayes have it, 3 votes to 2, to make those transcripts publicly available.
Thank you.
Is there anything else under Commissioner business? Mr. Mokrahysky, I believe it's time for a review of assignments.
Thank you, Chair. I have Commissioner Farr's request that I think we'll call an agenda team, a discussion for agenda team to review the recommendation from the Poverty and Homelessness Board regarding the creation of a hazardous weather task force. We'll review that for the appropriate next steps. Commissioner Bozevich's request, I just want to get this right. To continue with the definition of the footprint and reviewing the other concerns and comments that have been submitted to gain clarity regarding the floodplain ordinance. I get that right, basically. And Commissioner Trieger's request to update the open assignment regarding the polystyrene work session to include that work session should include the impacts of Senate Bill 582. I get that right?
Yes, and specifically.
Before an ordinance is, sorry, before anything is drafted.
Correct, thank you.
And then you just took the vote on releasing of the executive session. So I don't think that's an assignment. I think that was just an action that you took. So that's everything I had.
Thank you. I don't see any hands for corrections or clarifying. We are now going to go into executive session. Does anyone object to taking a 10-minute break and reconvening an executive session at 3:30? Well, let's say even 3:40, because Ms. Jones still needs to read us into executive session. But is that okay? We're pushing against 2 commissioners' time frames where they kind of need to leave by 5. Yes, Vice Chair Farr?
Affirmative on the short break, but the question, are we reading into both tomorrow's and today's executive session, or will we be reading into tomorrow's executive session separately?
Ms. Jones?
We will be reading into both executive sessions now.
Then I need to declare a potential conflict of interest.
Please.
Commissioner Farr, I do not believe it's an AFSCME executive session tomorrow.
Oh, I thought I read that tomorrow is.
Let me just double check it, but you can go ahead and declare your conflict. I'll double check.
Before we convene an executive session, I wish to publicly declare a potential conflict of interest pursuant to ORS 244-020 because my son is a member of AFSCME and is a steward for that union.
Could you read us in, Diana?
Yes, one moment. The Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session on Tuesday, September 21st and Wednesday, September 22nd to consider the employment of a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent, and to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to carry on labor negotiations. The executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.660 2A and D, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. The board reserves the right to come back out into public session should the need arise.
Thank you very much. We shall convene executive session at 3:40. Thank you.